All right, a couple of questions from Sunday morning services. First of all is, I, like most Christians, worship on Sunday. However, the fourth commandment instructs me to worship on the Sabbath, or Saturday, as I understand. Are there biblical references to support my worship schedule on Sunday? Okay, well, first of all, the Old Testament actually doesn't call for worship on the Sabbath. It calls for rest on the Sabbath day. Worship happened all week long at the temple. It wasn't exclusive to Sabbath day. And in fact, there was a special note that priests had dispensation on the Sabbath so they could put the showbread out and things like that. So the Old Testament says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's not a statement of worship, but personal worship, but of rest. Second thing is, in terms of the New Testament and worshiping on the first day of the week, when Christ rose from the dead, he rose on the day after the Sabbaths were completed, the Sunday, the first day of the week. And that's when they found the tomb empty. And so you find throughout the New Testament references to the church gathering on the first day of the week. For instance, in Acts chapter 20, it says that the church gathered to break bread on the first day of the week, Acts 27. In 1 Corinthians 6:2, Paul tells the church, on the first day of every week, each person put aside so that collections can be made. So in other words, it sounded like the church in Corinth was meeting the first day of the week, and people were bringing their offerings to those worship services. Now we know the early church met almost every day. It says daily they were going house to house and meeting, worshiping, and praying. But it does seem that the early church pretty quickly followed the tradition of celebrating the worship of Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection on the first day of the week, on Sunday, because that's the day of his resurrection. And so the church in Acts, and also we have this note in 1 Corinthians, started following this tradition of worshiping on the first day of the week. And it seems like they followed it pretty quickly after the resurrection, that this became the distinction of the early church from Judaism, that this marked them as different. Judaism had set aside a Sabbath day of rest. My guess is many of the Jewish Christians probably still rested on the Sabbath day, but when it came to time of the church gathering together and worshiping together, that they got together the first day of the week and honor the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we know that every year at Resurrection Sunday, the Sunday after Passover, that the church gathered for a huge worship celebration. This has been the case for over 2,000 years. And we also have a strong early church history to note that the early church fairly quickly embraced Sunday as the best day to worship because of the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the tradition of worshiping on the first day of the week goes back to the day Jesus rose again from the dead. It's honored in Acts chapter 20, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, also noted in a couple other places in the New Testament, and so that's why we worship on the first day of the week. We follow that tradition all the way back to the apostles. Second question is, if Jesus was tempted, yet without sin, Hebrews 2:17 through 18, but it says if you lust, you have murder in your heart, you're guilty of committing those. Temptation implies wrestling with it, right? So temptation equals sin? The answer is no, I don't think those are the same at all. Temptation and sin are not the same. Temptation, from this perspective, Jesus was tempted by the devil. Let's take that as the display of temptation. Temptation is that the availability of sin is there, but Jesus did not succumb to it at all. He didn't even entertain it. So the kind of temptation that we're talking about with reference to Jesus was tempted in all ways is demonstrated in the three major temptations that are put before him by the devil: the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. And Jesus doesn't entertain them. He doesn't think, ooh, that would be tempting. He immediately responds with Scripture and rejects them. And so when the writer of Hebrews says he was tempted as we are, yet without sin, I think he in particular has in mind the temptation of Jesus there with the devil, where the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life are presented to him, Matthew 4 and the other Gospels, but especially Matthew 4, that Jesus in that moment displays temptation without sin. He doesn't entertain the devil's idea. He immediately responds to it by saying, no, and here's scriptural reason why I shouldn't. When we hear the word, I was tempted, what we really mean by that was our neighbor says something, we get angry, and in my heart I start thinking, what an idiot, I'd like to kill this person. Jesus never entertained those thoughts. His neighbor offended him, and he immediately thought in terms of grace or mercy. And so when he's tempted, the answer is, did he have the opportunity to sin against his neighbor? Yes. Did he, with his mind or heart, sin against his neighbor? The answer is no. When you and I are confronted with those kinds of things and we entertain actually hatred towards our neighbor, we are actually sinning. And you can say, well, they're tempted to sin. No. You think evil thoughts against your neighbor, you have actually sinned. That's not a temptation. That's a violation. So temptation implies opportunity to sin with heart, mind, soul, will. Sin involves breaking through that and through that area of opportunity to actual sin with heart, mind, or attitude. Jesus never did that. Jesus never had one nanosecond of a bad attitude towards God or his neighbor. None of us can say that about today, let alone about our entire life. And so when it says Jesus is tempted in all ways, it means the opportunity to sin with his heart or mind was there, but he never, ever entertained even one iota of a temptation, of a tempting thought that went beyond that. He always confronted it with truth. He always confronted it with the honor of his Father. He never let his mind think an evil thought. I know that's hard to imagine, but that really is the biblical standard for the holiness of Christ. If it were not true, he's not holy, and if he's not holy, his death pays nothing for our sin. So I think he is absolutely perfect in his heart and mind and all his attitudes. All right, good questions. We'll see you guys on Sunday morning.